There's lots and lots of older mirrorless cameras that you can use just to get a feel for a system or just to get a feel for mirrorless photography. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. It seems to me that mirrorless cameras are becoming very expensive these days, and it's not uncommon to pay £2,000 or dollars for a new body, and you can spend at least as much again on lenses. Well, now I've shot a lot of older mirrorless cameras on the channel and they are significantly cheaper. So if you're trying to get into mirrorless photography, or you just fancy exploring a different system, seeing if it's right for you, you can do it using older mirrorless cameras, which are very capable still. Despite the new features that new cameras have, older ones are still very capable machines, and they don't do any less now than they did when they were released. I'm thinking really of cameras maybe up to about 7 or 8 years old. Resolution is really in the area of 16 megapixels, although one or two do have more. We'll come to one of those shortly. There's lots and lots of older mirrorless cameras that you can use just to get a feel for a system or just to get a feel for mirrorless photography. So without further ado, let's get cracking. My first mirrorless camera is this one. This is the mirrorless camera that I bought in, I think it was 2013, around about that time. It's the Panasonic GH2. It's got this lovely flippy screen on it, right? This is a micro 4/3 camera, and these are pretty cheap at the moment. I think you can get one of these for around about £200, something of that sort. I'll put the actual value on screen. That is a kind of an estimate off the top of my head, so I'll put the actual value on screen. Now this is a lovely little camera. I've always liked this little camera, and there's something compelling about it. Like all mirrorless cameras, it will shoot pretty much any lens ever made, so you can knock yourself out shooting vintage lenses on this one. Because of that smaller sensor, there is a crop factor, and because the sensor really is quite small, then there's a 2x crop factor on micro 4/3 cameras. So for example, if you put a 50mm lens on one of these, then the effective focal length compared to 35mm will be 100mm. So it will, a 50mm lens on one of these will act as though it was a 100mm lens on 35mm film, or indeed on a full frame sensor. So you do get that crop factor. That makes it difficult to get wide angle lenses for these. So if you put a 28mm lens on one of these, then it's going to be, what's twice 28, 56mm. So that's not a wide lens at all. So it's not terribly easy to get wide lenses for these. To get the equivalent of a 28mm, you'd need a 14mm vintage lens, and they are very expensive indeed. So wides are a bit of a problem, but once you've got over that, that said, you can shoot pretty much any vintage lens ever made on it, and I've shot loads of them on this one. You can also buy a thing called a focal reducer, and I'll put an image of one on screen. And what a focal reducer does is it takes that image that is, so say you've got a 50mm lens on here, it behaves as 100mm. If you adapt it using a focal reducer as your adapter, it will squish that image, and what falls onto the sensor is an image round about 90% of what you would get with the original lens. So focal reducers are a great way to shoot vintage lenses on a micro 4/3 camera. I would suggest, if you're going the focal reducer route, get an M42 one. Get a reducer that lots and lots of lenses will fit onto. So an M42 mount, a Pentax K mount, that sort of thing, then you'll be able to explore a wide range of lenses and shoot them pretty much as they would have shot on a 35mm camera or on a full frame digital mirrorless camera. No focus peaking on the GH2 unfortunately, and that is a handicap. Focus peaking is a great way to shoot vintage lenses, and I think it's necessary, to be honest. It does have a magnification feature, so you can punch in and you can see a big magnified section of your shot, so you can see exactly what you're focusing on and get your focusing very sharp, but that's a little slow. It's not as quick as peaking. The GH3 that came after this does have peaking, and that's a very nice camera. The GH4 also has peaking, and I think sensor stabilization. I'll find out and put it on screen. The Micro Four Thirds cameras that do have stabilization, the stabilization is really, really good because the sensor is small and you only need to move it a small amount to account for to compensate rather for the differences in motion, little vibrations and shakes that you get when using a camera by hand. So GH3, GH4 might be a better camera, but the GH2 is very, very accessible and it's a very nice little camera. And if your eyesight is really sharp, you probably don't need focus peaking to shoot vintage lenses. So a very nice little camera available nice and cheaply. This is my second mirrorless camera. This is the camera I bought that I graduated to after using the GH2 for a while, and this, as you can probably see, is the original Sony A7 OG version, the Mark I. This is where it all began, and this is a beautiful little camera. This has a full frame sensor in it, so this is the camera that I've shot all of the lenses on for the channel. All the vintage lenses for the channel have been shot on this very camera. It's got 76,000 clicks on it, so it's certainly done its work. It's been very reliable, it's never broken down, and it's still in good condition. It's a really small camera too. It's beautifully compact, very, very small little thing. Let's have a closer look. There's its little name badge, so you can see it really is an A7, and it's a beautiful little thing. Check out the back. It's got a screen on the back, all the mod cons. It will move to pretty much any angle you want, so that's a very nice screen. It's not a flippy screen, unfortunately, but it is a good screen. And look at the size of this camera. It's so tiny and thin. This is a very, very, very small camera, and it's kind of a shame how the A7 series has grown in bulk over the years. I understand that they've got to accommodate extra bits and pieces, but I think this was the perfect size, and it's kind of a shame that, you know, it's not that size anymore. But there we are. So 24 megapixel full frame sensor. I'll show you the sensor. There it is. There it is, just shining there. Lovely old thing. I'll put the cover back, the lens back rather, so that we don't get too much dust and dirt on it. There's the top deck. Everything you need is there. Lots of customizable buttons on this camera, 2 control wheels, and it really is a photographer's camera. It's a lovely, lovely little thing. In use, it's fantastic. Actually, it's said to have slow autofocus. I haven't shot many autofocus lenses on it actually, but the ones I have shot on it seems perfectly fine to me. Later models might be faster, and I'm sure they probably are, but I wouldn't say the A7 is lacking in its autofocus abilities. In fact, I'd say it's pretty good. It's great for shooting vintage lenses because it shoots the lenses just the same way as they shot on 35mm film, so you can see all the foibles, quirks and everything. You can see the edges of the shot, everything just like it was on film, and the old lenses shoot magnificently on this lens. Sony cameras are said not to have good colour. I don't think they're quite as good as some other camera manufacturers, but they're certainly not bad colours. They're best in strong sunlight, and in strong sunlight they can be really beautiful. This camera doesn't have the adjustability in terms of colour that the later cameras do. It doesn't have the as much adjustment in the profile settings, but I think colours are fine. Video is fine. It'll do 1080, and I have shot quite a few episodes on this camera in the earlier days, and you know, it's not perfect. There are one or two foibles it has when it's shooting video, and the video isn't quite as good as later cameras will do, and certainly it doesn't have the flexibility in terms of video that later cameras do. But video's okay. It will shoot a nice little bit of video for you, no problem. Very, very nice little camera. You can buy one of these for probably starting around £250 to about maybe 400 for one that's almost never been used. But a beautiful little camera, great if you want full frame. There's also, of course, the original Mark I A7R, and that's a camera with very high resolution. As I recall, that has a 40 megapixel sensor, so that can make images with very, very high resolution indeed. And that's a really nice camera, and it might be a better buy actually than the original A7. The A7 has one or two faults that the A7R doesn't. In fact, one that springs to mind is the lens mount. The lens mount is a known weak point on the A7. Now, I've hung many lenses off this lens mount. I've changed lenses hundreds, maybe thousands of times. There's a little bit of wear, but it's never broken, and I've had some very heavy lenses on it, like the Helios 40, for example. Nevertheless, the A7R has a strengthened lens mount, and the A7R lens mount is much more durable, much more hard wearing. As well as that, you've got the extra resolution, so you can crop in if you like to crop, and the A7R has no electronic shutter. The A7 does have an electronic shutter which you can use entirely on its own, or electronic first curtain shutter. Well, now, the A7R has only a mechanical shutter, whereas the A7 has electronic and mechanical. The A7R has only mechanical. So it's a bit noisier. It is a pretty noisy old thing to use, but it's a great camera. It gives massive resolution. It's very small and portable. It's a really powerful imaging machine. It's got a strengthened lens mount, and it's got that mechanical shutter. So that might suit you better. That might be a better camera for you to use than the A7. There's also the Sony APS-c models, beginning with the Nex 3 and the NEX 5. Those are now seriously cheap cameras. They don't have a viewfinder, but they're great little mirrorless cameras if you just want to dip a toe into the waters and see whether you like it or not. There is also the NEX 6 and 7 models. Those models have a viewfinder, and they have increased resolution. I think they have 24 megs over the next NEX 3 and 5's 16, as I recall. I'll put the proper details on screen. The Sony a6000 picked up where the NEX 7 left off, and that's a very nice little camera, very, very powerful. And indeed, you can still buy a very similar camera to that today in the form of the Sony a6400. That is a development of the camera that began right the way back at the NEX 3 series, so you can still buy a similar camera today. NEX 3s and 5s, very, very cheap. NEX 6s and 7s, maybe around £300–400, somewhere around that mark. The A6000 a little more expensive, but very capable, very powerful little cameras from Sony. Now, one range of cameras that I particularly love is the Fujifilm XT range and their XE range, also the X Pro. Basically anything from Fuji, or almost anything that's got an X in front of it. Those are fantastic cameras from my point of view. I do like the Fuji cameras, and there are many, many of those that you can buy that are now really cheap. They all have APS-c sensors. There is no Fujifilm full frame model. There is a Fujifilm medium format, or I don't think it's quite as big as the old 120 film used to be, but it's a big, big sensor, bigger than 35mm. That I think is called the GFX, their GFX series, but those are really expensive. So we're looking here at the Fujifilm APS-c cameras. The X-T10 is a real bargain. It's got the X-Trans 2 sensor, I believe, and it's a beautiful, beautiful sensor. It's the same sensor that was used in the X-T1 and the X-E2. I've got to look at my notes because it's really confusing the way Fujifilm number their cameras and sensors. But that is a beautiful sensor in the X-T10, the X-T1, the X-E2. It's 16 megapixels, and all of those cameras have the Fujifilm film simulations, and that means that you can get brilliantly coloured JPEGs straight out of camera. No need for mucking about editing and doing lots of editing if that's not your thing. It's not really my thing either, actually. So that's partly why I like these cameras so much, is that they just spew out beautiful JPEGs straight out of camera and no need for any editing. X-T10, X-T1, X-E2 all have the same sensor. It's a very, very beautiful sensor. It might be the nicest of the Fujifilm sensors. It's the X-Trans 2 sensor, as I recall, if I remember properly. Prices for those cameras, where you can get an X-T10 around £300, maybe a little cheaper, an X-T1, which is the SLR style. X-T10 is also SLR style but slightly cut down. The X-T1 is SLR style but has more features. You'll probably get a nice one of those for around £300 to £400, and the X-E2, again, probably a nice one for around £300 to £400. All of those cameras have a very, very beautiful Fujifilm sensor, which I think is probably the sweet spot of the Fujifilm sensor range. There are also the Fujifilm X Pro 1 and the X-E1. Those have the X-Trans 1, I think, sensor. I will put it up on screen if I get it wrong. That's a very, very beautiful sensor. It's a stunning sensor, but those cameras don't have the range of focus peaking colours. So if you like to shoot vintage lenses, the X Pro 1 and the X-E1, although they have beautiful sensors and give very, very exquisite images, not the best for shooting vintage lenses with, because they only have the white peaking colour, and it's not terribly easy to see sometimes. The later cameras, X-T10, X-T1 and X-E2 that we just talked about, those have green, sorry, not green, they have blue, red and white peaking. So a peaking colour for any range of conditions that you might encounter. Much better for vintage lenses. But if you're only shooting electronic lenses, automatic focus lenses, modern lenses, an X Pro 1, beautiful choice, and also an X-E1, very nice choice. The X Pro 1 has a viewfinder that's switchable between electronic and optical, so that's a nice feature if you like that kind of thing. I must admit I found it a bit gimmicky, but many people love it, and I'm sorry if I've just said that I don't like a favourite feature of yours. Many people love it, I know, and get on with it fine. Personally, I didn't. But if you like the older camera experience, an optical viewfinder is a really nice thing, so you might want to consider an X Pro 1. Finally then, the final camera that I want to talk about today is one that I really liked. It's the Olympus. I'll have to look at my notes because I can't remember the name, it's quite long. It's the Olympus OMD EM10. That's quite a name. But it's a beautiful, beautiful little camera, and it's very small. It's really tiny in proportion, so I love that. Anything that's small and light is great as far as I'm concerned. And it has some of the nicest colours of any camera that I've shot. It's not quite as nice as the Fujifilm colours, but I don't think any camera is. I think Fujifilm really have nailed it with their colour science, but Olympus are, gosh, certainly in the EM10, only a whisker behind. Beautiful colours that the Olympus cameras give, and that goes right across the Olympus digital range, the Olympus mirrorless range. They all give very, very, very lovely colours. They're all micro four thirds cameras. The OMD EM10 is micro four thirds. All the EPs and the EPL cameras are micro four thirds. Everything is micro four thirds in the Olympus lineup. I have previously bemoaned the fact that Olympus didn't make a digital version of their OM1 mechanical camera. That would have been a beautiful camera, but you know, they didn't make one, so there we are. We have the micro four thirds models, which are really, really lovely little cameras. They do have that 2x crop factor that the GH2 has because of that micro four thirds sensor, but they do give very beautiful colours. And there are lots of cheap cameras available across the Olympus mirrorless range. The OMD EM10 is only one of them. That camera you can buy for around about £200 to £300 for a good one in really nice condition. But all the EPL models are pretty cheap as well. The EP1, the first mirrorless camera that they made, it's a rangefinder style camera. That you can find for, well, I recently saw one for £80. 3 years ago I bought one for £50. Prices have gone up a little since then, but it's an old camera. There are a lot of models that came after them, so they're not really worth very much anymore. You can find one for around about £80. Certainly for £100 you'd find an EP1. Then there's the EP2 and the EP3 cameras, very, very nice, all the way up to the most recent one, which I think is the EP10, but they start very, very cheap, and you can find something like an EP3 or an EP4 for around about £200–300. Those are beautiful little cameras, and they'll give you those fantastic Olympus colours. So a really nice range of cameras. Something for everybody and something to suit every pocket in the Olympus models too. A really, really good source of cheap mirrorless cameras. So as you can see, there are some bargains in mirrorless cameras, some very cheap cameras out there, and they're great for if you're wanting to get into mirrorless photography, just to see if you like it, see how it works for you, or if you just want to explore a different camera system, if you just want to try the Fujifilm system, for example, or if you want to look at the Olympus Micro Four Thirds system, just play around with a different camera ecosystem. You can do that for really for not much money at all. And if you don't pay too much in the first place, you will be able to sell those cameras on if you're not too keen on them. And you shouldn't lose money. In fact, you might even make a bit of a profit, but it won't be too much either way, as long as you've paid a reasonable price in the first place. So do your research, find out how much they're worth. Don't buy the first one you see, and don't pay too much, and you are on safe ground. So there we are. Lots of lovely mirrorless cameras to try. As for me, that is it for now. So many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode and found it entertaining and useful. If you've enjoyed the episode, please do chuck us a sub. That would be appreciated. Many thanks to subscribers for your support. I do appreciate very much everybody who has subscribed, and many thanks to patrons for your support. I absolutely appreciate all of you. Without that support, this channel couldn't work in the way that it does. So a heartfelt thanks to everybody for their support. As for me, that's it for now. So if you're not doing anything too logical, rational, or mathematical next week at around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.